And welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I'm blessed to be joined by Dr. Micah Watson. He's Professor of Politics, Paul Henry Chair for the Study of Politics and Christianity at Calvin University. And one of the things I want to point out about this conversation, he's joining us to talk about C.S. Lewis on politics and principles. And you hear me talk about Lewis quite a bit on this program. One of the things I want to highlight is that Lewis epitomizes what it means to be what one might call a Christian public intellectual or a public theologian. And so Micah is joining us to talk about how Lewis, in his Christian wisdom, has a lot to say on politics and principles. Micah, thank you for joining us. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Very glad to be with you, and very glad to have you share your wisdom with us. I want to begin with broad strokes here to ask you to share about C.S. Lewis and why it matters for the average Christian to grapple with the things that Lewis grappled with.
Well, sure. One way to answer that is to think about what the Christian tradition has given us when it comes to politics. Mm-hmm. The Old Testament has something of a constitution for government. The New Testament doesn't really have that.
That's right.
Right? And so Christians for 2,000 years have been trying to figure some of these things out with honoring Scripture and honoring the tradition of the church, but while also having to figure out what's the best form of government. And Lewis, I think, is someone who helps us do that. He doesn't always give us particular answers on whether we should have a bicameral legislature or what the marginal tax rate should be, but he helps us think deeply about human nature, about what it looks like to live well together, about human flourishing, and then has a remarkable knack for presenting ideas in ways that can go from the ivory tower, but also go down just to regular folks and make things intelligible. So.
Exactly. And so what are some of the works of Lewis that we want to consider if we want to think about his political thought?
Yeah, he does not have a reputation as a political thinker. Mm-hmm. Some of the work I've been involved in has been trying to change that perception. But one of his most popular books is Mere Christianity. In Mere Christianity, he has a chapter called Social Morality, which deals quite a bit with politics, and there he goes in and discusses what a left-leaning society might look like and a right-leaning society, and how a Christian approach would probably have elements of both those things. But you really find a lot of meat in some of his essays which aren't quite as well known. So there's a collection of his essays called God and the Dock.
Yep.
And in the British system, the dock is where you sit when you're accused, and a number of essays in there. He has another collection called Present Concerns, which are little journalistic pieces. He has a piece on equality there. He has a piece on democratic education. And then if you prefer the more imaginative Lewis, you will find politics in the Chronicles of Narnia here and there. You will find natural law underneath the surface in his sci-fi or Ransom trilogy. So if what you understand by politics is our arrangements for how we live well together, a rather broad sense of politics, you actually will find it a lot of places with Lewis.
Everywhere. And basically that entire theme bears the thumbprint in all of his works. And so let's zoom into, say, Mere Christianity to start. In the section on Christian ethics, which leads into the section on the social order and moral living, he talks about how in Christianity it's not enough to just say I'm going to live well. The adage, I love that he says this because I come from a British tradition, and so that adage, be good, sweet man, if you can, be clever. No, he rewords it, be good, sweet man, and be as clever as you can.
Right.
Because he actually expects, as Christianity rightly expects, that the Christian faithful will bring the full bearing of our reason into our moral living, and then that overflows into how we think about our social living.
No, that's exactly right. He was worried about, sometimes when people would say, well, the church ought to give us a lead. That's one of the things he said. And he says, if we mean by that the church as in the people of God, then yes. If what you mean by that is our clergy, well, no, the clergy are very smart, do a good job, but what they've been specifically called to do is to do things that clergy do. Yeah. When he means the people of God and being as clever as you can, he's talking about Christians who are taking the Christian beliefs like the golden rule, do as you be done by, and Christian economists applying that to economics, Christian politicians applying it to government. So in a way, it's this another way of him putting the idea that we're supposed to be salt and light, and not just the professional clergy doing that. In fact, when the church does that, he thought arguably we get in some trouble. But when the church, as the people of God, are taking their faith and thinking well, cleverly, smartly, with integrity about how to advocate for justice in the political realm, then he's pretty excited about that prospect.
In fact, the entire premise of Mere Christianity is that he's bringing to the Christian inquiry the full bearing of his reason but he's not doing it so that he can tell people, look at how great I'm doing it. He's trying to pave a way for the average Christian to think about it. And so when you go on to that entire section on social living, social morality, he's expecting that we will bring the same full bearing of our moral reasoning into how we conduct ourselves in the social sphere.
I think that's very well put. He was, in many ways, about as elite as one can be. He's living in the ivory towers of Oxford, and he's enjoying that. But he also interacted with regular people, and had essays in which he would say, of course, we need elites to do their elites' job well, but we also need regular folks, because a lot of the problems we have are when elites get too ahead of themselves.
Yes.
And we need regular folks to kind of say, not so far, we need you to come back and pay attention to common sense. So in one sense, he combines an appreciation for the sort of brilliance that we want and need from our leaders, while also the sort of, genuine, authentic, salt-of-the-earth reliance on regular people who have common sense and wisdom. So it's really a nice combination of Christianity, which he said at one point, Christianity requires, he said the word, a prig like me to eat flesh and drink blood, right, to take the Eucharist. And it also requires regular folks to think about the argument in Romans by St. Paul, which is a pretty high-level sort of reasoning. So it's a both and.
I couldn't agree more. Now, to sort of zero in a little more into that conversation on social morality and therefore political morality, in his God in the Dock essays, one of the areas, so much of what he talks about in those essays has to do with a just order, and in particular when he talks about justice and mercy and how he says the justice of God is gentler than any human mercy. But he's creating a kind of juxtaposition here to the necessity of a social justice within the social order that's held to account before an almighty God.
He has a great line. He has a sermon called The Weight of Glory.
Yes.
And in that sermon, he's basically saying, you've never met a mere mortal.
Yep.
Everyone we come across will someday either be so glorious that today we would be tempted to worship them, or so awful, because they are in hell, that we would shrink them from them as if in a nightmare. And he goes on to say that human beings are immortal, and the life of nations, civilizations, and such is to our life that of a gnat. So he does want to. He fought for his country. He believed that there can be a sort of chastened, appropriate patriotism, but ultimately, the country's institutions, courts, those are secondary things, and the first thing is going to last forever. So he definitely had his kind of Augustinian order of loves there really nicely put together.
Exactly, and I'm really glad you brought up the weight of glory too, because he will rightly highlight that after he believed in a kind of Eucharistic reality, right, in his Anglicanism, and so after that presence of Christ in the Eucharist,
that's right. The most precious thing you take after that is going to be your neighbor.
Your neighbor,
right.
exactly.
Yeah,
You've
right.
never met a mere mortal. I'm talking with Dr. Micah Watson, and he is a professor of politics and the Paul Henry Chair for the Study of Politics and Christianity at Calvin University. We're talking about the wisdom of C.S. Lewis on politics and principles. We have about a minute left in this segment, Micah, and we're going to continue on the other side. But before we take our break, just very briefly, if you can speak to our viewers and listeners about what's a good way to get inducted into a kind of social thought of Lewis.
It's hard for me not to answer that question somewhat self-referentially. I did co-author a book with Justin Dyer called C.S. Lewis on Politics and the Natural Law. That might be for if you're more ambitious and really want to get into the nitty-gritty of Lewis. That would be one way to do it. And I apologize, but you asked. I think
Don't apologize. I'm glad you did it.
I'll see the same thing that Lewis would say about reading Plato and Aristotle, which is, don't start with the secondary literature. Start with the great thinkers themselves. And I'll apply that in my own case. Don't start with the book I just mentioned. Start with Lewis. Mere Christianity is a great place to begin. He begins that book by actually talking about the natural law. And the natural law, I think, is an important belief and doctrine for Christians. He then will go on and talk about all sorts of things, and including that chapter on social morality. And then, I think it would take some doing, but the particular essays in those collections I mentioned will be great places. Democratic education, equality. He's got an essay called Membership, which deals with a lot of political things. And if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of Lewis, there are his letters. And his letters, you get to see him unplugged, if you will, talking about this or that, about politics.
Talking with Dr. Micah Watson, who is an expert on C.S. Lewis. We're going to take a break, continuing on the other side. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. And we're back. I'm talking with Dr. Micah Watson. He is professor of politics and the Paul Henry Chair for the Study of Politics and Christianity at Calvin University. We're talking about the political principles and thought of C.S. Lewis. So, Micah, you packed all of that into the end of that segment. I really appreciate that. So, let's go back to mere Christianity from a grander perspective. Like you mentioned, he begins with the whole conversation on natural law, and you can actually see the intellectual exercise of his natural law systematic thinking throughout the rest of the book, even as he grapples with theology. And as a convert myself, I had a great appreciation for the fact that he showed that great rapprochement between reason and the faith had to go hand in hand, and nor should it ever be separated. Can you speak to that in terms of living in society as Christians?
Yeah, I think he would have appreciated it. Was John Paul II who said that
reason
and faith are the two wings upon which the bird of human flourishing takes flight. Something like that. I apologize for not getting it quite right.
The human soul ascends to God.
That's it. Yeah, so from a Calvin guy, I did okay. But
you did really good.
Yeah, he did not see those two things as in competition, right? But as part of our inherent dignity as human beings. And so he certainly wrote books and gave talks that would draw upon reason, and I think had a knack for doing that in a way that could be understood both by other scholars at Oxford and Cambridge, different places, but also by members of the RAF or people just on the trains, regular folks. His Mere Christianity started off as radio broadcasts that the BBC put out to a very war-weary Britain during World War II. And then, of course, he also talked about sometimes the limits of reason. And there are different places in his fiction where reason has run its course, and you really do need God's help and God's
grace,
God's gift of grace and God's gift of divine revelation. We're not just working with the natural reason, like Thomas talks about. You have the eternal law, within which is natural law as well as divine law. And so for Lewis, that's another both and. God has not been stingy with what he's given us to try and make sense of this world that he's given us.
In the you brought up Thomas, so I'm going to have to touch on that. But it's very clear that Lewis was at least conversant in Thomistic thought, because, like you mentioned, so in the Prima Pars of the Summa, Thomas makes clear the natural law is nothing more than the participation of the rational creature in the mind of God in His created order. Lewis not only embodies that, he starts seeing how in the incarnation especially, man's participation in the Christian life goes from, like you mentioned, this natural order, and then grace elevates the natural human nature into the level of thinking like God, divine revelation.
Right. No, I think that's well put. And he was, he would not call himself a Thomist, but clearly knew Thomas. He loved Richard Hooker in the Anglican tradition, but if you look at where Hooker gets his draws his thing, it comes from Thomas. He did say that he often referenced Thomas as a sort of, if I want to figure out something about what would be, he looked at Thomas as a repository of good commentary on all sorts of medieval philosophy and theology. So definitely, aware of him and drew on him for some of his thought.
So the reason I asked you to comment on that is because when we think about the incarnation and therefore think about the person of Jesus Christ, one of the most famous arguments to come out of mere Christianity is the whole liar, lunatic, Lord conversation. And if I may throw in this whole adage of the legend as well, and the distinction there being that Christ was not a legend that was superimposed after the fact. Right. But and Lewis actually addresses that in the historical principle. With all of that, what Lewis highlights is, from a natural historical perspective, the person of Jesus Christ is the singular, most monumental figure in human history. And that has a bearing on how we ought to think about our presence in human history.
Oh, I think that's right. He actually draws upon his day job, if you will, which is to be a scholar of literature. And in talking about the Gospels, with regard to the legend idea in particular, he says, that's not how legends are written.
That's right.
So he and Tolkien both were just top-of-the-line experts on Norse mythology and Greek mythology and all these things. And when you were writing legends to make something up, you would not write it the way you would have the Gospels. So to go back to your point, the Gospels show us a person, and Lewis would sometimes capitalize the P in person, talking about Jesus, who is utterly singular and yet relatable. Right? We are made in God's image, and Jesus is our sounds weird to say, but our brother in some sense, and then enables us to take on his nature, which is how he concludes Mere Christianity, which gets into some of the deeper, more mystical aspects of what it will look like when we leave this vale of tears, the shadowlands, and come home to our real destination, to be with the Lord.
Which then leads to this reality, which is the core point of what you've been talking about, that therefore Jesus Christ is Lord even over our political operations.
Oh, absolutely. Lewis was very wary of the pretensions of government, and that's we have the whole story on that, given his background. But Jesus is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and if you took at his most famous works, the Narnian books, it is Aslan the lion, right, who is the king, and so it makes sense for us as Christians to be wary of government overreach and those sorts of things, and yet we cannot reject government and authority itself, because we ourselves are members of the kingdom of God, and we have a king who is promised to come back. So I think Lewis would be very in the forefront of making sure that message was clear.
One way I see this implicitly happen is in the witch confronting Aslan before asking for a life to be shed upon the stone table. And so Aslan it's a throwaway line, but the movies actually, I know the movies don't do the books tremendous justice, but this line was highlighted very well, and it says this. It's where Aslan says, "Don't talk to me about the old magic witch. I was there when it was written.
Right.
I am the Lord of even the political order, the political laws that govern the order that you see right now.
Right.
The laws that you're trying to use, you're trying to evoke."
Right. No, it's a great flex. Right.
It's a great flex.
He was there. He was there in the beginning. Occasionally, I run into colleagues more on the Protestant side who are very skeptical about natural law. Isn't natural law somehow detracting from the revelation of Jesus? These are folks who would be, influenced by folks like Karl Barth. And it's like,
yeah.
Jesus authored the natural law. He was there in the beginning.
Right.
In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was with God. So it's just a category mistake in my view to try and separate those two things. No, I think that's a great line from the film. The films look better to me in retrospect now, and I'm hoping that the new ones coming out on Netflix will be faithful.
Will they though?
Didn't
they get Meryl Streep to play Aslan?
That was the rumor. I think it's turned out not to be true.
Oh, thank the
Lord. Which would be a great relief. Now that doesn't mean that they'll be good, but that would be an atrocity, a narrative atrocity if they did it. She's talented.
And a willful deviation of the author's intent.
Oh, it would really be a sign of, I think, of bad faith.
Yeah.
So I am hopeful. Hope is a theological virtue, but it's a cautious and not a real. We'll see. I'm hopeful, but I don't have my hopes too high.
Okay. You know what? I will share that with you. You've raised my hope just a tad.
Very good.
I was completely skeptical about it before. Okay. So to go right back to this entire reality that Christ is not only the one who is the author of the laws that we ought to think about in governance, he is also the one who ought to be directing our moral accountability. That doesn't mean that we're calling for a Christian theocracy.
No.
In fact, we should shy away from that.
Lewis called theocracy the worst of all forms of government. He was vehemently opposed to theocracy. And wrote an article. It's called "Another Meditation on the Third Commandment." The third commandment is at least in Lewis's tradition, is taking the Lord's name in vain.
Yep.
And that when we take political positions that are not directly from the Christian faith, and we add the Christian party name to it, we are, in his view, taking the Lord's name in vain. There certainly are things that flow from our faith into politics, the anti-slavery movement, for example. But there are a number of things that do not, and for as long as there's been people, politicians and kings and others in authority have found it useful to add God onto their platform, and Lewis was vehemently against that. He found that very problematic.
And rightly so.
Yes.
But Lewis also understood that those who are entering into public office were, he doesn't use the term covenant, but they're entering into a kind of covenanting process because they're swearing oaths. And oaths are accountable before Almighty God. And so he understood that while we don't want a theocracy, we want our leaders to be accountable to the ultimate source of moral accountability.
Yeah, and he did defend both the British royal family and the Church of England in part because they don't have coercive power, but they remind us that there are things higher that we should give honor to, and ultimately that honor should go to God. But no, I think that's right. Politics is a practice that is a second thing, but in that oath taking that you mentioned, we are connected to the first thing, which is God. So.
Now, we've got about a minute or so left in the broadcast. For all of our listeners right now, the average American must be steeped in the natural law and with hearts and minds steeped in Jesus Christ and His Word, so that we can be good social and political citizens.
Yeah, I think that flows from that. I think those two things, to know Christ is our telos, right?
Yes.
That is the reason that we are here. If there have been some examples of people who have come to the faith because they thought it might help civilization. And I think God could use that. But of course, as we said before...
You're a very hopeful man.
God does amazing things.
Yeah, He does, yeah.
Ayaan Hirsi Ali was one of these figures, I think, who seemed to come to Christianity first. Well, this will be really good because it keeps away these bad things. But of course, the first thing has got to be the first thing. So God can use that, but to know God, to know Christ, to love Him with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and our neighbor as ourselves, that is the first thing. And then I think we will see some of these other great things flow out from it, including good things for politics. Lewis said that you aim at heaven, you get earth thrown in. You aim at earth, you'll get neither.
Yeah. Micah, I thoroughly enjoyed this. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks.
My guest is Dr. Micah Watson. He's Professor of Politics, Paul Henry Chair for the Study of Politics and Christianity at Calvin University. And he's been regaling us truly with the political wisdom of C.S. Lewis. The truth is, if we know how to look for it, there's an integral whole within the Christian faith and therefore within Lewis's writings about how to operate within our social and therefore political life. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.